I was assigned to Station 47 in early October. The posting came through without explanation, which wasn't unusual for positions in the remote monitoring network. The brief said I'd be working nights at a decommissioned radar installation in the mountains, maintaining passive observation equipment and logging atmospheric data. Standard rotation, 3 months on, 2 weeks off, then reassignment based on performance and operational needs. The station sat at the end of a gravel road that climbed through dense forest for 40 kilometers before reaching the plateau where the installation had been built sometime in the late 1960s. The landscape up there was all rock and stunted pine, with fog that rolled in most afternoons and stayed until morning. The nearest town was 3 hours down the mountain by truck. Population maybe 800, mostly older people who'd worked in the timber industry before it collapsed. Nobody from town ever came up to the station. I asked the supply driver about that once, early on, and he just shook his head and said the road was too rough for civilian vehicles. I didn't press it. The installation itself was larger than I'd expected. 3 radar dishes, 2 operational, and 1 permanently disabled, mounted on concrete foundations that had cracked and shifted over the decades. The main building was a rectangular structure with small windows and thick walls, built to withstand mountain weather. Inside were the control room, equipment storage, a small kitchen, sleeping quarters, and a maintenance workshop. Below ground level, accessed by a steel door at the end of the main corridor, were the older systems, backup generators, cable runs, ventilation equipment, and archive materials stored in filing cabinets that nobody had opened in years. My supervisor during the handover was a man named Petrov. He was maybe 60, gray-haired, quiet. He'd been working the day shift for 11 months and seemed ready to leave. He showed me the routine, over the course of a week, walking me through the equipment, the logging procedures, the maintenance checklist. Everything was analog. The radar displays were circular screens with sweeping green lines, the kind you'd see in old films. The computers, where they existed, ran ancient operating systems on hardware that predated modern networking. Nothing here connected to the outside world except a single encrypted radio line for weekly status reports. The work itself was simple. Monitor the radar displays, record any atmospheric anomalies, calibrate the equipment according to the schedule, check the generators, maintain the heating system, file reports every morning at 0600 hours using the radio transmitter. Petrov emphasized that last part. The reports had to go out on time, every day, using the prescribed format. He showed me the logbook where previous operators had recorded their transmissions, page after page of identical entries stretching back years. Weather clear, systems, nominal, no anomalies detected. Next report, 600 hours. I asked him what would constitute an anomaly worth reporting. He looked at me for a moment, then said anything that deviated from background noise. Unusual atmospheric reflection patterns, interference from unknown sources, objects appearing on the display without corresponding meteorological conditions. He said it in a flat tone, like he was reading from a manual, and then he told me it had never happened during his shift. The station mostly picked up weather patterns and occasionally logged commercial aircraft, transiting the region at high altitude. That was all. Petrov left on my 8th day. The supply truck took him down the mountain in the morning, and I watched from the control room window as it disappeared into the fog. Then I was alone. The night shift officially began at 1800 hours, though I started my preparations earlier. The station was heated, but inefficiently, and the control room was always cold after sunset. I'd light the small electric heater near the workstation and make coffee using the ancient percolator in the kitchen. The coffee was Turkish, thick and bitter, shipped up from the supply depot, along with tinned food, bottled water, and diesel for the generators. I'd drink 2 cups before starting my first equipment check. The radar displays sat in a row along the main console. 2 were active, showing overlapping coverage areas. The left screen monitored the northern approach, covering about 200 kilometers of airspace from ground level to 20,000 meters. The right screen covered the eastern valleys and the plateau itself. The sweep lines rotated slowly, once every 4 seconds, painting green traces across the black screens. Most of the time, the displays showed nothing except the faint speckle pattern of ground clutter and atmospheric scatter. I'd begin by checking calibration. Each radar had a test function that generated a reference signal at a known position. If the test signal appeared where it should, the system was aligned. If it drifted, I'd adjust the synchronization using the mechanical controls beneath the console. Petrov had shown me how to do this, emphasizing that calibration was critical. An uncalibrated radar could produce false contacts or miss legitimate ones. After calibration, I'd inspect the physical equipment. The rotating mechanisms in the dish, assemblies, the cooling fans, the power supplies. Everything had to be documented in the maintenance log with timestamps and condition notes. By 2,000 hours, I'd usually finish the technical work and settle into monitoring mode. This was the bulk of the shift, watching the displays, checking for changes, recording anything unusual. In practice, unusual meant almost nothing. The screens remained empty except for the slow rotation of the sweep lines and occasional bright spots that appeared and vanished as the radar detected rain or snow at altitude. Sometimes I'd see a commercial aircraft, a small bright point moving in a straight line across the display. Altitude and speed consistent with scheduled passenger flights. I'd note these in the log, even though they were routine. Contact bearing 045, altitude 11,000 meters, speed 850 kph. Likely commercial transit, duration 4 minutes. Then the aircraft would leave the coverage area, and the screen would go back to showing nothing. The isolation didn't bother me at first. I'd worked remote positions before, fire watch towers and weather stations, places where you spent weeks without seeing another person. This was similar. The station was comfortable enough. I had books, a portable radio that picked up 2 stations from across the border, and enough space to move around when I needed to stretch my legs. During the day, I'd sleep in the small bedroom off the main corridor, windows covered to block the light. At night, I'd work, monitor, document. The routine was predictable, which I found reassuring. The first anomaly occurred on my 16th night. I was sitting at the console around 30 hours, drinking coffee and reading a technical manual I'd found in the equipment storage. The radar displays were clear, showing the usual ground clutter and a light precipitation pattern over the northern valleys. Then, without any buildup or gradual appearance, a contact materialized on the right screen. It wasn't like the aircraft transits I'd logged before. Those appeared at the edge of the coverage area and moved inward as the plane approached. This contact simply appeared, already present, approximately 60 kilometers northeast of the station. It showed as a bright return, stronger than weather scatter, but without the characteristic motion of an aircraft. I watched for a full sweep cycle. The contact remained stationary. I checked the equipment first. Standard procedure for unexpected readings. Calibration was correct. Power levels were nominal. No errors indicated on the status panel. I looked back at the screen. The contact was still there, unmoving, same position, same intensity. I noted the bearing and approximate range in the log, then continued observing. For 3 minutes, nothing changed. The contact sat there, bright and static, while the sweep line rotated past it again and again. Then, between one sweep and the next, it vanished. Not gradually fading like an aircraft leaving coverage, just gone. The screen returned showing only ground clutter. I reviewed what I'd seen, trying to determine if it warranted a report. The guidelines Petrov had given me were vague. Anything unusual, he'd said, but also that nothing unusual ever happened. I decided to document it in the maintenance log as a possible equipment artifact. Contact observed, bearing 045, range 60 kilometers, duration approximately 3 minutes, no motion detected, disappeared without transition. Likely calibration anomaly or atmospheric reflection. I made a note to run additional diagnostics during the next maintenance cycle. The rest of the shift was quiet. I transmitted my morning report at 1600 hours using the standard format. Weather overcast, light precipitation, systems nominal, no anomalies detected. I didn't mention the contact. It seemed minor, probably nothing, and the reporting guidelines emphasized brevity. After the transmission, I secured the control room, checked the locks on the exterior doors, and went to sleep. I thought about the contact occasionally over the next few days. It bothered me in a vague way, not because it was necessarily significant, but because I couldn't explain it. Stationary radar returns weren't common. Aircraft moved, weather systems moved. Even ground features that produced false contacts had recognizable patterns and positions. This had been different. Sudden appearance, fixed position, abrupt disappearance. But equipment malfunctioned sometimes. Sensors produced glitches. I'd probably witnessed a momentary failure in the signal processing, nothing more. The second anomaly occurred 6 nights later. Same time frame, between 0200 and 0300 hours. I was monitoring the displays when a contact appeared on the left screen, the one covering the northern approach. This time, I was paying closer attention, having thought about the previous event enough that I was half expecting something similar. The contact appeared suddenly, same as before, approximately 75 kilometers north of the station. Bright return, stationary, no altitude information because the system couldn't determine vertical position without motion tracking. I immediately began documenting. Time of appearance, 0217 hours. Bearing, 358. Range, approximately 75 kilometers. Signal strength, high, consistent with metallic object or dense atmospheric formation. I ran a quick diagnostic on the radar system. Everything checked out. The contact remained visible. I watched it for 10 minutes. It didn't move, didn't fade, didn't change intensity. Just sat there on the screen, sweep after sweep, unnaturally fixed. Then, at 227 hours, it disappeared. One sweep it was present, the next sweep showed nothing. This time, I couldn't dismiss it as an equipment fault. 2 similar events, both during the night shift, both showing the same characteristics. I reviewed the maintenance log to see if Petrov had recorded anything similar during his tenure. The log went back 18 months, covering his entire assignment. Every entry was routine. Equipment checks, calibration procedures, minor repairs. No unusual contacts, no anomalies detected. Nothing that resembled what I was seeing. I considered reporting it during my morning transmission, but decided against it. The guidelines required documentation of anomalies, but these contacts were brief and unverified. Without additional context or supporting data, they might be interpreted as operator error or system malfunction. I needed more information before filing a formal report. Instead, I made detailed notes in my personal log, separate from the official documentation. I recorded the times, positions, durations, and characteristics of both contacts. I noted the similarities. Both appeared during early morning hours, both were stationary, both vanished without transition. If it happened again, I'd have a pattern to reference. It happened again 4 nights later. 0241 hours, right screen, eastern coverage area. Contact appeared at bearing 067, range approximately 80 kilometers. Same profile, bright return, stationary, no motion. I documented everything. I took photographs of the screen using a camera I'd found in the equipment storage, making sure to capture the sweep line, the contact position, and the timestamp display. The contact remained visible for 8 minutes this time, longer than the previous events. I watched it carefully, looking for any variation in intensity or position. There was none. At 0249 hours, it disappeared. 3 events, 3 separate positions, all at significant range from the station, all displaying identical behavior. This was beyond coincidence or equipment failure. Something was producing these returns, something the radar was detecting and displaying according to its design parameters. But what? I spent the rest of that shift reviewing the technical documentation for the radar systems. The manuals were stored in the equipment room, thick binders filled with schematics and operational specifications. The radars were old Soviet-era installations, built for long-range air surveillance during the Cold War. They operated in the UHF band, which gave them good range and reasonable resolution, but made them susceptible to certain types of atmospheric interference. The technical notes included lists of known false contact sources, temperature inversions, precipitation layers, flocks of birds, metallic chaff released during military exercises. None of these matched what I was seeing. The contacts were too consistent, too isolated, too precisely positioned. I also found, buried in one of the binders, a section on operational protocols for anomalous detections. The language was formal and bureaucratic, typical of military documentation, but the content was specific. Operators were instructed to log any contacts that appeared without corresponding identification data. These logs were to be maintained separately from routine documentation and transmitted to a central analysis facility on a monthly basis. The section emphasized that operators should not attempt to interpret or explain anomalous contacts. Observation and documentation were sufficient. Analysis would be conducted by specialized personnel with access to broader data sets. This was different from what Petrov had told me. He'd said unusual detections never occurred, but the protocol suggested they were expected, or at least anticipated. I searched for the separate logbook mentioned in the documentation. It took me an hour to find it, stored in a locked cabinet in the underground section. The key was on the main key ring, labeled with a number that corresponded to the cabinet designation. The logbook was old, its pages yellowed and brittle. The earliest entries dated back to 1971, written in Cyrillic script using fountain pen. I couldn't read the older entries fluently, but I could make out dates, times, and bearing notations. The format was similar to what I'd been using in my personal notes: time of appearance, position, duration, characteristics. The entries were sparse at first, maybe 1 or 2 per year. Then, starting in the early 1980s, they became more frequent. Multiple entries per month, sometimes clustered over consecutive nights. I paged through the logbook carefully, trying to identify patterns. The entries continued through the 1980s and into the 1990s, then stopped abruptly in 1997. After that, nothing. No entries for over 25 years, as if the anomalous contacts had simply ceased. But that didn't make sense. If the phenomenon had ended, why maintain? The protocols? Why keep the logbook locked in a secure cabinet? I looked at the last entry more closely. It was dated November 14th, 1997, written in neat Cyrillic script. Contact observed 0334 hours, bearing 112, range 95 kilometers, duration 22 minutes. Stationary profile, signal strength variable, disappeared without transition. Below that, a second note, added in different ink. Operator relieved of duty pending review. Station operations suspended pending evaluation. Suspended. Not closed, not decommissioned. Suspended. I thought about what Petrov had told me during the handover. The station had been officially decommissioned in the late 1990s. Its role in the air defense network made obsolete by more modern systems and changing strategic priorities. But it had continued operating in a limited capacity, maintained for atmospheric monitoring and data collection. Except, the equipment was the same. The radar systems were unchanged. The protocols were still in place, including the ones for logging anomalous contacts that supposedly never occurred anymore. I returned to the control room and checked the current date. November 9th, 5 days before the anniversary of that final entry. I didn't know if that meant anything, but I noted it anyway. The contacts continued. Over the next 2 weeks, I logged 11 more events. They occurred exclusively during the night shift, always between 200 and 400 hours. The positions varied, scattered across the coverage area at ranges between 60 and 100 kilometers. Each contact appeared suddenly, remained stationary for anywhere from 3 to 20 minutes, then disappeared without transition. The signal characteristics were consistent: bright returns, high intensity, no motion tracking data. I documented everything in the anomalous contact log, using the format from the older entries. I also maintained my personal notes, recording observations that didn't fit the official format. The feeling of unease that preceded some. Appearances, the way the control room seemed quieter when contacts were present. The strange sense that the radar wasn't detecting these objects so much as responding to them. That last thought bothered me. It suggested intentionality, which was absurd. Radar systems were passive sensors. They transmitted radio pulses and detected reflections. They didn't respond or anticipate. But I couldn't shake the impression that the detections followed a pattern, not in their positions or timing, but in their relationship to my presence at the station. They had started after I arrived. They occurred during my shifts. They seemed calibrated to the edge of my awareness, appearing just often enough to be undeniable, but not so frequently that they became routine. I decided to review the archive materials in the underground section more thoroughly. I'd been down there several times for maintenance checks, but I'd never examined the filing cabinet systematically. They contained decades of documentation: maintenance records, personnel files, operational reports, technical bulletins. Most of it was mundane, but I was looking for anything that might explain the contacts or the station's actual purpose. I found the first useful document in a cabinet marked Operational Directives, 1985-1995. It was a memorandum stamped Restricted, dated March 1986. The The text was brief, written in formal administrative language. All operators assigned to Station 47 were instructed to maintain continuous monitoring during designated observation windows. Anomalous contacts were to be logged according to established protocols, without interpretation or analysis. Operators were forbidden from discussing detections with personnel at other installations or attempting independent investigation. The memorandum concluded with a reminder that Station 47 served a specialized monitoring function, separate from standard air defense operations. Specialized monitoring function. That phrase appeared again in other documents I found. A status report from 1989 referenced the station's unique detection capabilities. A personnel evaluation from 1992 noted that the assigned operator had maintained appropriate discretion regarding specialized observations. None of the documents explained what those observations were or why they required discretion. I also found personnel records for previous operators. There had been 17 assignments between the station's initial activation in 1969 and the suspension in 1997. Most operators served for less than a year. Several had requested early transfer. 3 had been relieved of duty for unspecified reasons. The record for the final operator, the one who'd written that last logbook entry in November 1997, indicated he'd been transferred to administrative duties and subsequently retired from service 6 months later. What had he seen during those 22 minutes? What had made the facility command decide to suspend operations? I returned to the control room with more questions than answers. The sun was setting, fog rolling in across the plateau. I prepared for the night shift with a growing sense of unease. The contacts were real. They were documented. They followed patterns that suggested deliberate observation rather than random atmospheric phenomena. And the station, despite its official status as a decommissioned monitoring post, remained equipped and staffed to detect them. That night, I decided to modify my observation protocol. Instead of simply logging contacts when they appeared, I would try to anticipate them. I reviewed my documentation, looking for any regularities in timing or position. The timing seemed random within the 2-hour window, but the positions showed a subtle pattern. The contacts appeared in a rough arc, approximately 70 to 90 kilometers from the station, spanning bearings from 350 degrees through 110 degrees. That arc corresponded to the mountainous region north and east of the installation, an area I'd seen on the topographic maps but never visited. At 0 to 15 hours, I began a systematic scan of that arc, adjusting the radar parameters to maximize sensitivity. I increased the gain, reduced the clutter filtering, lengthened the integration time. The displays became noisier, showing more ground scatter and atmospheric returns, but also more detail. I watched carefully, waiting. The contact appeared at 0237 hours, bearing 073, range 82 kilometers. But this time, because I'd been watching that sector closely, I saw something I'd missed before. The contact didn't materialize instantaneously. It faded in over the course of 3 or 4 sweeps, growing from a barely detectable signal to a bright return. And once it stabilized, I noticed something else. It was pulsing, very slowly, brightening and dimming, with a period of approximately 40 seconds. I documented this in detail, noting the gradual appearance and the pulsation pattern. I also noticed that my equipment, the control console and monitoring displays, seemed to be running warmer than usual. The ventilation fans were working harder, and there was a faint electrical smell in the air, like ozone. I checked the power systems. Everything showed normal, but the temperature reading in the control room had increased by 3 degrees. The contact remained visible for 15 minutes, pulsing steadily, then began to fade. The dimming was gradual, mirroring the appearance, and took about 30 seconds. When it was gone, the control room temperature started dropping back toward normal. I sat there, staring at the empty display, trying to process what I'd observed. The pulsation suggested a powered source, something generating a signal rather than passively reflecting the radar beam. The temperature increase suggested the station's equipment was working harder, drawing more power, possibly interacting with the contact in some way. None of this fit the model of passive atmospheric monitoring. I spent the rest of the shift reviewing technical documentation, trying to find any reference to active detection modes or signal interaction protocols. I found nothing definitive, but I did locate a technical bulletin from 1988 that mentioned resonance effects during anomalous detection events. The bulletin recommended that operators monitor power consumption and equipment temperature during such events, and report any significant deviations. This implied that the relationship between the station and the contacts was more complex than simple observation. At 0600 hours, I transmitted my daily report. Weather clear, fog clearing, systems nominal, no anomalies detected. The lie felt heavier this time, more deliberate. I was concealing information that was clearly meant to be documented, but I didn't know who would receive that documentation, or what they would do with it. The protocols I'd found emphasized logging and reporting, but they didn't explain the purpose or the destination of those reports. For all I knew, the anomalous contact log was never actually transmitted anywhere. It simply existed, filed away. A record of events that officially didn't happen. The contacts increased in frequency. By late November, I was logging 3 or 4 events per night. They appeared across the same arc, always at significant range, always displaying the slow, fade-in, and pulsation characteristics I'd now learned to recognize. The duration varied. Some contacts lasted only a few minutes. Others persisted for over half an hour. I began to notice additional patterns. Contacts that appeared closer to bearing 0 degrees due north tended to be briefer and more intense. Contacts toward the eastern edge of the arc, near bearing the 110 degrees, were longer lasting but dimmer. I also noticed that the station's equipment was behaving strangely during detection events. Power consumption would spike, sometimes enough to trigger alerts on the generator monitoring panel. The radar displays would show faint interference patterns, like ripples spreading outward from the contact position, and the control room temperature would rise consistently by between 2 and 5 degrees. None of this was documented in the maintenance logs from previous operators. Either they hadn't noticed these effects, or they'd chosen not to record them. I updated my personal notes with detailed observations, but I continued filing routine reports via the morning radio transmission. Weather conditions, system status, no anomalies. The fiction felt increasingly uncomfortable, but I didn't know what else to do. Breaking protocol without understanding the system seemed dangerous. On November 18th, I decided to investigate the contact positions physically. The arc where the detections occurred was accessible, theoretically. There were old logging roads that ran through the mountains to the north and east, remnants of the timber industry that had operated in the region decades ago. I had a topographic map that showed these roads, though I didn't know their current condition. During my next supply delivery, I asked the driver if the northern roads were still passable. He looked at me for a long moment, expression unreadable. "Why would you want to go up there?" he asked. "Checking equipment," I said. "There might be a transmitter or relay station in that area affecting the radar." "There's nothing up there," he said. "Roads are washed out anyway. Haven't been maintained since the 90s. "Are they really impassable or just difficult?" He shrugged. "People don't go up there. Not sure anyone's tried in years." "Why not?" "No reason to." He left without elaborating, and I didn't push it, but his reaction confirmed something I'd been suspecting. The area where the contacts appeared wasn't just remote or inaccessible, it was avoided. People who lived near these mountains, who'd spent their entire lives in this region, chose not to venture into that particular section of forest. There was no obvious reason for it, no posted warnings or legal restrictions, just an unspoken agreement that certain areas were better left alone. I considered hiking in, but the distances were prohibitive. 70 to 90 kilometers through mountainous terrain in late November, with snow already accumulating at higher elevations, wasn't feasible as a solo expedition. I'd need proper equipment, multiple days, and a level of preparation I couldn't accomplish while maintaining the night shift. The contacts would have to remain unexplained, at least in terms of their physical source. Instead, I focused on understanding the station's response to them. I began running experiments during detection events, carefully adjusting the radar parameters and observing how the contacts reacted. When I increased the transmission power, the contacts brightened slightly and their pulsation rate increased. When I decreased power, they dimmed and slowed. This suggested a direct relationship between the station's output and the contact characteristics, as if the radar wasn't just detecting these objects, but somehow energizing them. I also discovered that I could influence when contacts appeared to a limited extent. By pre-positioning the radar sweep to focus on specific sectors and increasing sensitivity in those areas, I could sometimes trigger an appearance earlier than expected. It wasn't precise control, more like creating conditions where contacts were more likely to manifest, but it was repeatable. On 3 consecutive nights, I focused the scan on bearing 085 degrees, and all 3 nights produced contacts in that sector within 30 minutes of the focused observation. This changed everything. If the station's operation influenced the contacts, then the relationship wasn't passive observation. It was interaction. The radar wasn't detecting pre-existing phenomena. It was participating in their manifestation, maybe even causing them. That implied the station had been built, or at least configured, to do exactly this. The specialized monitoring function mentioned in the documents wasn't about watching atmospheric conditions. It was about maintaining a specific type of signal interaction with something in the mountains. But what? And why? I returned to the archives, searching for any technical documentation that might explain the system design. I found scattered references in maintenance records and technical bulletins, mentions of resonance tuning and phase-locked operation that suggested the radars had been modified for purposes beyond standard surveillance. I also found a schematic, folded and tucked into the back of a filing cabinet, showing the radar systems connected to additional equipment I hadn't recognized in the control room. The additional equipment was located in the underground section, in a room I'd noticed but never examined closely. It was locked, and I'd assumed it contained more storage or backup systems. Using the schematic as reference, I identified the door and found the appropriate key on my ring. The lock was stiff from disuse, but it turned. Inside was a secondary control station, smaller than the main one, but equipped with its own displays and monitoring equipment. The systems here were older, more primitive, built around vacuum tube amplifiers and mechanical switches. Everything was powered down, covered in dust, clearly unused for years. But the equipment was still connected. I traced the cables running through conduits in the walls, leading back up to the main radar systems. The central piece of equipment was labeled Phase Correlation Detector, and it looked like something from the 1960s. The control panel had 3 large dials, a series of indicator lights, and a paper chart recorder. I found the operation manual stored in a metal box bolted to the wall. The manual was technical, dense with mathematics and signal processing theory, but I worked through it slowly over several nights. The phase correlation detector was designed to identify coherent signals hidden within noise. It compared the phase relationships of multiple radar returns, looking for patterns that indicated artificial rather than natural sources. In standard operation, this would be used to detect stealth aircraft or other low observable targets that were deliberately trying to avoid detection. But the manual included a section on anomalous coherence patterns that describe signals with characteristics inconsistent with known aircraft or atmospheric phenomena. These signals, according to the manual, appeared at specific frequencies and exhibited unusual phase stability. They could be enhanced by tuning the radar transmission parameters to match their resonance characteristics. The manual emphasized that such tuning should only be performed under specific operational conditions and required authorization from facility command. It also noted that prolonged exposure to enhanced anomalous signals could affect equipment performance and operator perception. That last point made me stop reading. Operator perception. What did that mean? I paged forward, looking for elaboration, but found nothing. The manual ended with a list of maintenance procedures and a reminder that the phase correlation detector was classified equipment subject to operational security requirements. I powered up the system carefully, following the startup sequence in the manual. The vacuum tubes took several minutes to warm up, glowing orange in the dim light of the underground room. When the system was ready, I connected it to the main radar feeds and began monitoring. That night, at 0254 hours, a contact appeared on bearing 092, range 78 kilometers. On the main displays, it looked like every other contact I'd logged: bright return, stationary, pulsing slowly. But on the phase correlation detector, something different appeared. The chart recorder began scratching out a trace, showing a complex waveform with multiple frequency components. The pattern was structured, repeating with minor variations every 43 seconds. It looked like a signal, not natural noise, something organized and information-bearing. I watched the trace develop, trying to make sense of the pattern. The waveform had a primary frequency around 280 MHz within the radar's operating band, but with modulation sidebands that extended well beyond what atmospheric phenomena should produce. The phase relationships were stable, locked with precision that suggested an artificial source, but there was no identification data, no transponder code, nothing that indicated what was generating this signal or why. The contact lasted 19 minutes. During that time, the chart recorder filled with traces, dozens of waveform cycles, all showing the same structured pattern. When the contact faded, the trace stopped, returning to background noise. I tore off the chart paper and examined it closely. The pattern was unmistakable. Something was transmitting from the mountains, and the station's radar was designed specifically to detect and enhance that transmission. I spent the rest of the shift reviewing what I knew. The station had been built for specialized monitoring. That monitoring involved detecting coherent signals from specific geographic areas. The signals appeared during nighttime hours and could be enhanced by adjusting the radar parameters. Previous operators had logged these detections for decades until operations were suspended in 1997. Now, 25 years later, the detections had resumed, and I was documenting them using the same protocols. But who was reviewing these logs? Where were the reports being sent? I checked the radio transmission procedures again, looking for any indication that anomalous contact data was included in the daily transmissions. I found nothing. The daily reports were standardized, brief, containing only basic status information. The anomalous contact log existed separately, locked in its cabinet, accumulating entries that nobody seemed to collect or review, unless the collection happened differently. The supply runs occurred monthly, always on schedule, always with the same driver. He would deliver provisions, refuel the generators, perform basic maintenance checks, then leave. But he also had access to the building. He carried keys. He could enter the underground section, retrieve documents, replace equipment. The official supply manifests I signed covered only the delivered goods, not what might be taken away. I decided to test this. During the next supply run, scheduled for November 28th, I would check the anomalous contact log immediately after the driver left. If entries had been removed or copied, I'd know the system was still active, still collecting data for some unseen purpose. November 28th arrived cold and clear. The supply truck came up the mountain around 1,000 hours, right on schedule. I met the driver outside, helped him unload the provisions: food, water, diesel, propane, miscellaneous supplies. We worked in silence, as usual. He handed me the manifest. I signed it. He nodded, got back in his truck, and drove away. I waited until the sound of the engine faded completely, then went to the underground section. The cabinet containing the anomalous contact log was still locked. I opened it with the key and removed the logbook. The pages were exactly as I'd left them. My entries from the past 6 weeks filling nearly 20 pages. Nothing had been removed. Nothing had been copied, as far as I could tell. The logbook remained complete, undisturbed, but when I returned to the control room, I noticed something I'd missed before. The radio transmission log, the one documenting my daily reports, had been updated. Someone had added a stamp to the most recent entries. Received and processed. The stamp was in red ink, barely visible unless you were looking for it. It hadn't been there before the supply run. The daily reports were being received. Someone was processing them. But if the reports contained only routine status information, what were they processing? I reviewed my transmission logs carefully. The format was standardized: weather conditions, equipment status, operational notes. I'd been filing these reports for 6 weeks, always using the prescribed format, always ending with "no anomalies detected." Then I noticed something in the prescribed format itself. The reports had a section for operational notes that I'd been leaving blank or filling with trivial observations. Routine maintenance completed, no issues observed, standard phrases that conveyed nothing significant. But the format allowed for this section to be populated with coded information. There was a reference table in the transmission manual showing numeric codes corresponding to various operational conditions. Code 14 meant equipment malfunction. Code 27 meant weather interference. Code 43 meant observation. Window active. Observation window. I found the definition in the glossary at the back of the manual. It referred to periods when the station was monitoring for specialized signals. The codes were how operators communicated about anomalous contacts without using explicit language over the radio. By including code 43 in the operational notes section, an operator could indicate that detections were occurring without describing them directly. I checked my previous transmissions. I'd never used any codes. I'd filed every report as routine, with no coded operational notes, effectively telling whoever was receiving these transmissions that nothing unusual was happening, but the logs showed otherwise. The contacts were occurring nightly, multiple events per shift, documented in detail. The receiving station knew about the logbook. They knew the protocols. By filing routine reports, I'd been signaling that no observation window was active, that the specialized monitoring function was not. Producing results. Except it was. I'd been documenting everything in the logbook, just not reporting it via the radio transmissions. This created a discrepancy, a gap between what I was observing and what I was reporting. I didn't know if that gap mattered, but I suspected it did. The system was designed for operators to document and report anomalous contacts using the established channels. By maintaining the logbook, but filing routine reports, I'd been following half the protocol while ignoring the other half. I decided to correct this. That night, during my next scheduled transmission, I would include code 43 in the operational notes. This would signal that the observation window was active, that specialized detections were occurring. I didn't know what response this would trigger, if any, but it felt necessary to follow the complete protocol. At 0600 hours on November 29, I transmitted my daily report. Weather clear, temperatures below freezing, systems nominal, operational notes, code 43. I waited for acknowledgement. The response came 30 seconds later. Report received. Code 43 note acknowledged. Maintain observation protocols. Next status transmission, 0600 hours. The response was different from the usual brief acknowledgement. Someone had read the coded note and provided specific instructions. Maintain observation protocols. That phrase appeared in the documentation I'd found, always in the context of anomalous contact detection. It meant continue logging, continue monitoring, continue reporting. I felt a mix of relief and apprehension. The system was working as designed. I was now part of an operational framework that extended back decades, connecting me to previous operators who'd sat in this same control room, watching these same displays, documenting these same unexplained contacts. But I still didn't know what we were monitoring or why it mattered. The contacts continued, now with the added awareness that my observations were being processed and reviewed by someone, somewhere, who understood what these signals meant. I maintained the logbook with increased diligence, documenting every detail: appearance times, positions, durations, signal characteristics, phase correlation patterns. The logs from late November and early December filled the remaining pages in the current logbook. I found a replacement in the archive cabinet, a blank book with the same format, and continued my documentation. On December 7th, something changed. The contact appeared at 0219 hours, bearing 204 degrees, range 73 kilometers, almost due north. It followed the usual pattern: slow fade in, bright return, steady pulsation. But after approximately 8 minutes, the pulsation rate increased. The period dropped from 40 seconds to 30 seconds, then 20, then 15. The signal intensity grew correspondingly brighter. On the phase correlation detector, the waveform trace became more complex, showing additional frequency components for CLI hadn't seen before. The control room temperature began rising faster than normal, climbing 6 degrees in less than 5 minutes. The ventilation fans struggled to keep up. I checked the power systems. The generators were running at nearly full capacity, far beyond what the station normally required. Something was drawing enormous amounts of power, and I couldn't identify the source. The contact continued brightening and accelerating. The pulsation rate reached 10 seconds per cycle, then 5. The radar display showed the return as an intense white spot, overloading the screen's phosphor coating. And then, at 2:34 hours, the signal changed completely. Instead of pulsing, it became steady. The intensity stabilized at maximum brightness. And on the phase correlation detector, the waveform trace showed something I'd never seen in any previous detection. The signal contained structured modulation, patterns within patterns, complex enough to potentially carry information. I grabbed the chart paper as it emerged from the recorder, examining the trace in real time. The modulation had a bit rate, a rhythm that suggested digital encoding. I wasn't equipped to decode it, didn't have the tools or training, but I could recognize that something was being transmitted, a message or data stream directed at the station. The transmission lasted 47 seconds. Then the signal dropped back to its normal pulsing pattern, and the contact began fading. Within 3 minutes, it was gone, and the control room temperature started dropping back toward normal. I sat there, staring at the chart paper, trying to process what had just happened. For 6 weeks, I'd been observing passive contacts, signals that appeared and disappeared without variation. Now, suddenly, one of those signals had activated, had become something more than a simple radar return. It had transmitted data, potentially directed specifically at this station, during a period when the station was actively monitoring and reporting. I documented everything in the logbook, including sketches of the waveform pattern and notes about the power consumption spike. I also included a comment that this event was qualitatively different from previous detections and might warrant special attention. Then I prepared my morning report, including code 43 and an additional code I found in the manual, code 67, which indicated significant deviation from baseline observations. The response to my transmission came faster this time, less than 15 seconds after I finished. Report received, code 67 acknowledged, maintain observation, do not deviate from standard protocols, detailed report required at next weekly summary. Do not deviate from standard protocols. That was a warning, subtle but clear. I was being told to continue observing and documenting, but not to take any independent action. The weekly summary would provide an opportunity to describe what I'd observed in detail, but until then, I was to maintain routine operations. I spent the day analyzing the chart recordings from the event, trying to extract any meaning from the modulation patterns. The waveform had structure, definitely, but without proper decoding equipment or knowledge of the encoding scheme, I couldn't determine what information it carried. It might have been random, a natural process that happened to look organized, or it might have been an actual message, transmitted from somewhere in the mountains toward this specific receiving station. The weekly summary was due on December 10th, 3 days away. I used that time to prepare a comprehensive report, documenting all contacts from the previous month, with special emphasis on the December 7th event. I included measurements, waveform sketches, power consumption data, temperature readings, everything that might help whoever received this report understand what had occurred. On December 10th at 600 hours, I transmitted the summary using the encrypted channel, speaking clearly and methodically, describing each observation in technical detail. The transmission took nearly 20 minutes. When I finished, I waited for acknowledgement. The response was brief. Summary received, analysis pending, continue observation protocols. Next weekly summary, 0600 hours, December 17. Analysis pending. Someone would review what I'd reported, compare it to historical data, possibly make decisions about station operations based on my observations. But I wouldn't know the results of that analysis. The system was one way. I reported upward, received acknowledgments and occasional instructions, but never explanations or context. The contacts continued through mid-December, following their established patterns. Most were routine: slow fade in, steady pulsation, gradual fade out. But on December 14th, another structured transmission occurred, this time on bearing 037 degrees, range 81 kilometers. The pattern was similar to the December 7th event: normal contact appearance, followed by signal acceleration and then a burst of complex modulation lasting 39 seconds. I documented it thoroughly and included code 67 in my daily report. The acknowledgement came with the same instruction: maintain observation, report in weekly summary. The system was processing these events, analyzing them, but not responding to me with any information about what they meant or what actions were being taken. On December 17th, I filed my second weekly summary, describing both structured transmission events in detail. The acknowledgement was identical to the previous week: analysis pending, continue protocols. I was starting to feel like a sensor, a passive recording device rather than an operator with agency or understanding. My role was to observe and report, nothing more, but I couldn't remain passive. The structured transmissions were significant. clearly different from the routine contacts that had characterized the first weeks of my assignment. Something had changed, either in what was being transmitted from the mountains, or in how the station was processing those signals. I needed to understand what that change meant. I spent my off hours during late December reviewing every document I could find in the archives, looking for any reference to structured transmissions or signal modulation. I found scattered mentions in the technical bulletins from the 1980s and early 1990s, descriptions of phase-locked coherent bursts, and information-bearing modulation patterns. These were always discussed in the context of anomalous detections, suggesting they were expected phenomena, part of what the station was designed to observe. I also found a memorandum dated October 1997, 1 month before the station was suspended. The memo discussed increased signal activity and enhanced transmission coherence observed during September and October of that year. It noted that the signals had become increasingly organized and recommended that observation protocols be maintained with heightened vigilance. The memo was marked urgent and addressed to a central analysis facility whose designation was redacted. This suggested that the 1997 suspension had been triggered by events similar to what I was observing. The contacts had increased in frequency and complexity until they reached a threshold that prompted facility command to shut down operations. But why? If the station was designed to monitor these signals, why suspend operations when they became more active and organized? Unless the monitoring itself was the problem. Unless the interaction between the station and the signal source was creating feedback, escalating the phenomenon beyond acceptable parameters. The technical documentation I'd found mentioned resonance effects and equipment interaction with anomalous signals. What if prolonged monitoring didn't just detect the signals, but amplified them, encouraged them, created conditions where they became more frequent and structured? That would explain the suspension. It would also explain why the station had been reactivated now, after 25 years. Perhaps the signals had diminished during that time, dropping below detection thresholds, and only recently returned to levels that warranted renewed monitoring. Or perhaps something else had changed, some external factor that made observation necessary again. I considered asking these questions during my radio transmissions, but decided against it. The protocols were clear. Operators observed and reported. They didn't question or analyze. My role was defined by the system, and stepping outside that role would likely result in removal, just as it had for previous operators who'd been relieved of duty pending review. But I could continue documenting, could maintain detailed personal notes alongside the official logbook. If I was eventually relieved and someone else took over this assignment, those notes might provide context that the sterile logbook entries couldn't convey. The winter deepened. Snow accumulated around the station, drifting against the buildings, blocking the access road. The supply truck came on December 28th, its final run before the road became completely impassable. The driver delivered extra provisions, enough for 2 months instead of the usual one. He also brought additional diesel fuel and spare parts for the generators. These were preparations for extended isolation, suggesting that the road wouldn't be cleared again until March at the earliest. After he left, I was truly alone. No possibility of outside contact except via radio. No prospect of leaving, even if I wanted to. The station was my entire world now, its routines and observations the only structure in days that blended together without clear boundaries. The contacts increased in frequency again. By early January, I was logging 5 or 6 events per night, sometimes overlapping with multiple contacts visible simultaneously on different bearings. The structured transmissions also became more common. Between December 20th and January 10th, I documented 9 separate instances of complex modulation, each lasting between 30 and 50 seconds. The phase correlation detector showed that these transmissions were becoming more sophisticated. The modulation patterns were evolving, gaining additional layers of structure, suggesting either improving transmission capabilities from the source or more refined detection on the station's end. I couldn't determine which, but the trend was clear. Whatever was generating these signals was becoming more active and more capable of conveying complex information. On January 15th, the pattern changed again. The contact appeared at EO227 hours, bearing 358 degrees, range 76 kilometers, almost exactly due north. It followed the now familiar sequence: fade in, pulsation, acceleration, structured transmission. But this time, the transmission didn't stop after 30 or 40 seconds. It continued, maintaining steady complex modulation for over 4 minutes. I watched the chart recorder fill with waveform traces, page after page of structured signals. The pattern was intricate, far beyond what I could decode manually, but clearly organized. This wasn't random noise or atmospheric interference. This was information, transmitted deliberately, targeting this specific receiving station. And then I noticed something else. The signal characteristics were shifting during the transmission, cycling through different modulation schemes every 30 seconds or so. It looked like someone was testing the channel, determining what encoding methods would transmit successfully, what information density the station could handle. The transmission ended at 0231 hours. The contact faded normally, and the control room temperature began dropping. But I was left with 12 feet of chart paper covered in complex waveforms, a record of what was unmistakably an attempt at communication. I documented everything, including my assessment that the December through January transmissions represented an escalating pattern of attempted contact. I used code 67 in my daily report and prepared an unscheduled detailed summary for immediate transmission. This wasn't routine anymore. This was active signal traffic between an unknown source and this station, occurring with increasing sophistication and duration. I transmitted the summary at 700 hours, describing the 4-minute transmission in detail, emphasizing its unprecedented length and complexity. The response came 90 seconds later, longer than any previous acknowledgement. Report received, code 67 acknowledged, cease non-routine transmissions, maintain standard daily reports only, continue observation and documentation, do not adjust equipment parameters, do not deviate from standard protocols. Next weekly summary, 0600 hours, January 21. Cease non-routine transmissions. They were telling me to stop sending detailed summaries outside the scheduled weekly reports, continue observation, but stop communicating about what I was observing except through the routine channels. The message was clear. I was reporting too much, too urgently, and that urgency was unwelcome. But why? If the station existed to monitor these signals, why discourage detailed reporting when the signals became most active? The only answer that made sense was that someone already knew what was happening, had expected it, and didn't want excessive communication about it cluttering official channels. The observation was important, but not as a discovery. It was confirmation, documentation of events that were anticipated and understood by whoever was analyzing these reports. I felt suddenly isolated in a different way, not just physically, but informationally. I was part of a system I didn't understand, performing a function whose purpose remained obscure. The contacts were real, documented, transmitted, but I didn't know what they meant, where they came from, or why anyone cared about detecting them. I continued my observations through late January, filing routine daily reports and weekly summaries that described the ongoing contacts in technical terms without interpretation or speculation. The structured transmissions continued, occurring every few nights, each lasting between 2 and 5 minutes. The waveform patterns were becoming more refined, showing clearer organization and more consistent encoding schemes. On January 28th, I made a decision. During the next structured transmission, I would attempt direct interaction. The station's equipment included transmission capabilities, not just reception. The radar systems could send as well as receive. If something in the mountains was attempting to communicate with this installation, I could respond, could test whether the communication was truly bidirectional. This violated the protocols explicitly. The documentation was clear that operators should maintain passive observation only, never adjusting parameters or attempting active engagement. But the protocols were decades old, written for circumstances that might no longer apply. And I needed to know. After 3 months of watching these signals, documenting their evolution, I needed to understand what I was really observing. I prepared carefully. I reviewed the radar transmission controls, studied the modulation options, determined what parameters I could adjust without damaging the equipment or triggering automatic safety shutoffs. I identified a simple binary sequence I could transmit, a pattern that would be clearly artificial if detected, distinguishable from the normal radar sweeps. On February 3rd, at 0241 hours, a contact appeared on bearing 12 degrees, range 79 kilometers. It followed the standard pattern, building toward a structured transmission. When the modulation began, approximately 6 minutes after the initial appearance, I activated the prepared transmission sequence. The radar sent a brief burst, 3 seconds of modulated signal, directed toward the contact's bearing. I watched the displays carefully. For a moment, nothing changed. The contact continued its transmission unchanged. Then, approximately 8 seconds after my burst, the contact's modulation pattern shifted. The waveform on the phase correlation detector changed structure, adopting characteristics similar to what I'd transmitted. It held that pattern for 15 seconds, then shifted back to its previous form. I had received a response. Something had detected my transmission, analyzed it, and echoed it back with modifications. This confirmed bidirectional communication capability. The phenomenon wasn't just observable, it was interactive, capable of receiving and responding to signals from the station. I felt a mix of excitement and deep unease. I'd proven that engagement was possible, but I'd also violated operational protocols in doing so. And I'd potentially changed the nature of the observation, moved from passive monitoring to active participation in whatever process these signals represented. I decided not to report this immediately. The weekly summary wasn't due for 4 more days. I'd use that time to observe whether my transmission triggered any changes in contact behavior, whether the interaction had consequences I needed to document before reporting what I'd done. The contacts continued over the next 3 days, showing no obvious changes in frequency or characteristics. The structured transmissions occurred as before, following their established patterns. If my interaction had caused any disruption, it wasn't apparent in the routine observations. But on February 6th, something different happened. A contact appeared at 01:56 hours, earlier than the usual detection window, which typically ran from 0200 to 0400 hours. The position was also unusual, bearing 127 degrees, range 53 kilometers, much closer than previous contacts, and in a sector I'd never logged activity before. The contact didn't fade in gradually. It appeared fully formed, immediately bright, pulsing at a rapid rate I'd never observed. The phase correlation detector showed intense structured modulation from the moment of appearance, no buildup or acceleration. And the control room temperature spiked instantly, rising 12 degrees in less than 2 minutes. I monitored carefully, documenting everything, but I felt something had fundamentally changed. The contact wasn't following the patterns I'd spent 3 months learning. It felt reactive, responsive, like something had noticed my February 3rd transmission and was now probing back, testing the station's capabilities from a different approach vector. The contact lasted 31 minutes, far longer than average, and maintained complex modulation throughout. The waveforms were different from previous transmissions, more aggressive in their structure, cycling through encoding schemes rapidly as if searching for something specific. When it finally faded at 0227 hours, I sat in the silent control room, staring at the empty displays, understanding that I'd crossed a threshold. By transmitting, by attempting interaction, I'd changed the observation from passive to active. I'd invited response, and something had answered. I included code 67 in my daily report, but added no additional details. The weekly summary was due in less than 24 hours. I'd document the February 3rd transmission and the February 6th contact response in that report, accept whatever consequences followed, and hope that whoever analyzed these summaries would understand that I'd been trying to gather information, not cause problems. At 600 hours on February 7th, I transmitted my weekly summary. I described my February 3rd transmission honestly, explained my reasoning, documented the February 6th response contact in detail. I concluded by noting that the observation situation had potentially changed, that the phenomenon appeared capable of bidirectional interaction, and that updated protocols might be necessary given this development. The acknowledgement was longer than usual, arriving 70 seconds after my transmission ended. Summary received: your transmission on February 3rd represents unauthorized deviation from observation protocols. Such deviations are noted in your operational record. However, given the resulting data, your actions are classified as acceptable within discretionary operational parameters. Continue observation. Do not repeat unauthorized transmissions without explicit authorization. Updated protocols under review. Next weekly summary, 0600 hours, February 14th. Discretionary operational parameters. They'd given me latitude, acknowledged that my transmission had generated useful data, even though it violated standard procedures. But the warning was clear. No more independent actions without permission. I was to observe only, document what I saw, wait for instructions. The contacts continued through February, maintaining their increased activity level. The February 6 pattern repeated twice more, with contacts appearing outside the normal window and approaching from unusual bearings. These seemed to be responses to the changed observation situation, the phenomenon adapting to the knowledge that the station was capable of transmission as well as reception. I documented everything meticulously, filling page after page in the logbook, generating dozens of chart recordings from the phase correlation detector. The accumulated data painted a picture of something persistent and intelligent in the mountains, something that had been generating these signals for decades, waiting for monitoring stations to detect them, perhaps attempting contact with those stations on some level I didn't fully understand. My rotation was scheduled to end in early April. I'd received notification during the January supply run that my replacement would arrive when the access road cleared, typically late March, or early April depending on spring weather. I had approximately 6 weeks remaining at the station, 6 weeks to observe and document before someone else took over this assignment. I thought about what I'd tell my replacement during the handover, how much I could explain within the constraints of operational protocols. The documented procedures were clear and straightforward, but the reality of the observations, the sense of participating in something larger than routine monitoring that was harder to convey through official channels. I also thought about the previous operator, the one whose entries I'd found in the 1997 logbook. He'd observed similar events, had documented increasing signal activity until operations were suspended. What had he experienced during those final weeks? What had convinced Facility Command to shut down the station? The available records didn't provide answers, only the fact that something had happened significant enough to warrant suspending a decades-long observation program. On February 21st, the supply truck made it through for what would be the final delivery before my rotation ended. The driver brought provisions and fuel, plus a sealed envelope addressed to the station operator. I signed for the delivery and opened the envelope after he left. Inside was a brief memorandum on official letterhead. Operator, Station 47 observation protocols remain in effect. Continue monitoring through end of current rotation. Updated operational guidelines attached. Weekly summaries required through final week of assignment. Handover procedures to be provided prior to replacement operator arrival. The attached guidelines were minimal, mostly reiterating existing protocols with slight modifications. The observation window was now defined as 0100, 0500 hours, rather than the informal 0200 or 400 range I'd been using. Structured transmissions were to be given increased documentation priority, with waveform characteristics described in maximum available detail. And a new instruction. If contacts appeared at ranges closer than 60 kilometers, immediate notification was required via emergency radio channel. That last instruction concerned me. None of my observations had shown contacts closer than 53 kilometers, the February 6th event. But the guidelines suggested that closer approaches were considered significant, potentially dangerous, requiring immediate response rather than routine reporting. I continued observations through late February and early March, noting a gradual trend in the contacts. The average range was decreasing slowly, from the typical 75 to 85 kilometers down to 65 to 70 kilometers. The positions were also shifting, concentrating more tightly around due north, bearing 0 or 0 degrees. Whatever generated these signals was either moving closer to the station or focusing its transmissions more directly toward this receiving location. On March 8th, a contact appeared at 0234 hours, bearing 0 or 4 degrees, range 58 kilometers. This was the closest I'd logged since February 6th, approaching the 60-kilometer threshold that required immediate notification. I documented it carefully, monitoring for any unusual characteristics beyond the proximity. The contact showed standard structured transmission, lasting 3 minutes and 40 seconds, then faded normally. I included this in my March 10 weekly summary, noting the continuing trend toward closer approaches and tighter bearing concentration. The acknowledgement included an additional instruction: maintain heightened observation protocols, Document any contacts at ranges below 60 kilometers immediately via emergency channel before routine report. On March 14th, at 0307 hours, the threshold was crossed. A contact appeared at bearing 001 degrees, range 56 kilometers, 4 kilometers inside the notification boundary. I immediately switched to the emergency channel and transmitted a brief report. Station 47, contact observed bearing 001, range 56 kilometers, time 0307 hours, standard characteristics, monitoring ongoing. The response came within 30 seconds, faster than any previous acknowledgement. Station 47, acknowledged. Maintain observation. Do not adjust equipment. Do not attempt transmission. Monitor for signal characteristics and duration. Report when contact terminates. I monitored as instructed. The contact followed normal patterns initially, showing structured transmission after approximately 7 minutes. But at the 11-minute mark, something changed. The signal intensity increased dramatically, brightening beyond anything I'd observed before. The phase correlation detector's chart recorder struggled to track the waveform, the trace spiking off the scale repeatedly. The control room temperature rose rapidly, climbing 15 degrees in less than 4 minutes. The generators were running at absolute maximum capacity. I could hear them straining through the building's ventilation system, their normal steady rhythm becoming labored. And on the displays, the contact began showing motion for the first time. It wasn't moving in a conventional sense, not traveling across the screen like an aircraft. Instead, it was flickering between positions, appearing at bearing 001, then 359, then 002, then back to 001. Jumping around a narrow arc faster than the radar's sweep rate should allow. And with each position change, the range decreased fractionally. 56 kilometers, 55.8 kilometers, 55.6 kilometers. It was approaching. I transmitted an updated report via the emergency channel. Contact showing motion, range decreasing, approximately 55.5 kilometers, signal intensity extreme, equipment strain significant. The response was immediate. Acknowledged, do not adjust parameters, do not attempt transmission, observe and report. Extraction authorization, pending weather conditions. Extraction. They were considering pulling me out early, before my rotation. Ended because something about this contact warranted emergency removal of the operator. But the response also said, pending weather conditions. I looked at the meteorological instruments. A storm system was moving in, heavy snow expected within hours. No truck could make it up the access road in those conditions. If extraction was necessary, it wouldn't be possible until the storm cleared, which could take days. The contact continued its flickering approach, decreasing range by small increments. 55.2 kilometers, 55.0 kilometers, 54.7 kilometers. The structured transmission was continuous now, no pulsation, just steady complex modulation that the phase correlation detector couldn't fully process. The waveforms were too dense, too rapid, beyond the equipment's design specifications. At 0326 hours, the contact stopped moving. It stabilized at bearing 0 degrees, range 54.3 kilometers, still showing extreme intensity, but no longer approaching. The transmission continued, but the pattern shifted again, becoming something I hadn't seen before. The modulation formed distinct pulses, separated by precise intervals, creating a rhythm that felt almost like counting. I documented this and transmitted via emergency channel. Contact stabilized at 54.3 kilometers, transmission pattern changed, showing rhythmic pulse structure, duration ongoing. Acknowledged, continue observation, maintain current position. Do not approach windows or external areas. Don't approach windows. That instruction suggested concern about direct exposure to whatever the contact represented, as if proximity to the source might pose risks beyond equipment observation. I stayed at the console, monitoring the displays, recording everything. The rhythmic transmission continued for 17 more minutes. Then, at 0343 hours, it stopped abruptly. The contact didn't fade. It simply disappeared between one radar sweep and the next, gone completely. The control room temperature began dropping immediately. The generator load decreased back to normal levels. On the phase correlation detector, the chart showed only background noise. I transmitted a final report. Contact terminated at 03:43 hours, duration 36 minutes, disappeared without transition. All systems returning to nominal. Acknowledged, secure station, await further instructions. Do not conduct normal operations until authorized. I secured the control room as instructed, shutting down non-essential systems, checking all locks and closures. Then I waited. The storm arrived around 0500 hours, snow falling heavily, wind picking up. Outside visibility dropped to near zero. Whatever instructions were coming would have to wait until communication was possible again. I spent the day reviewing what I'd observed, trying to make sense of the contact's behavior. The approach, the stabilization, the rhythmic transmission pattern all suggested deliberate action, something testing boundaries or attempting to establish communication. Parameters. And the emergency response, the extraction consideration, indicated that whoever monitored this station understood these events as significant, potentially dangerous. The storm continued for 3 days. During that time, I maintained minimal operations, monitoring the radar, but not conducting normal observation protocols. The displays remained quiet, no contacts appeared. The phenomenon, whatever it represented, had withdrawn or was waiting. On March 18th, the storm cleared enough for radio communication. I transmitted my scheduled weekly summary, including detailed documentation of the March 14th event. The response came with new instructions. Summary received. Your rotation is extended through March 31st. Replacement operator arrival delayed pending operational review. Continue observation protocols. Enhanced monitoring during 0100-5000 window. Document all contacts regardless of range or characteristics. Extraction scheduled for April 2, weather permitting, extended. Rotation. My assignment was being stretched by 2 weeks because the replacement had been delayed. Or perhaps delayed because whoever reviewed these observations wanted continuous monitoring through a period they considered significant. March 31st was approaching the anniversary of something, though I didn't know what. The 1997 suspension had occurred in November. The station's original activation was in 1969, anniversary date uncertain. I resumed normal observations, maintaining the enhanced protocols. The contacts returned on March 20th, but their characteristics had changed. They appeared at greater ranges again, back to 70 to 80 kilometers, as if the March 14 approach had been a probe or test that was now complete. The structured transmissions continued but were briefer, lasting only 1 to 2 minutes instead of the extended durations I had logged in February and early March. This pattern persisted through the final 10 days of March. Regular contacts, moderate activity, nothing approaching the intensity or proximity of the March 14th event. I documented everything in the logbook, now on my 3rd volume since starting this assignment in October. The accumulated records represented 5 months of observations, hundreds of contacts, dozens of structured transmissions, a comprehensive data set about a phenomenon that remained officially unexplained. On March 31st, I filed my final weekly summary. I summarized the 5-month observation period, noted the overall patterns and trends, described the evolution from routine passive contacts to the more active and complex interactions of February and March. I concluded by noting that the phenomenon appeared to be cyclical or responsive, capable of both long-range passive transmission and closer-range active engagement. The acknowledgement included final instructions. Summary received. Secure all documentation for handover. Prepare logbooks and chart recordings for transfer. Extraction confirmed for April 2nd, 0900 hours. Replacement operator briefing will occur at facility command. Your assignment to Station 47 is concluded. On April 1st, I spent the day organizing materials, preparing the control room for handover. I secured the logbooks in their cabinet, organized the chart recordings chronologically, filed all maintenance documentation. The station was ready for the next operator, whoever they would be, whenever they would arrive. That night, I conducted my final observation shift. The displays remained quiet until 03:27 hours, when a single contact appeared. Bearing 00 degrees, range 72 kilometers, standard characteristics. It showed brief structured transmission, lasting 90 seconds, then faded normally. It felt like a farewell, a final acknowledgement from whatever existed in those mountains, confirming that the observation period was complete. I transmitted my final daily report at 600 hours on April 2nd. Weather clear, temperatures rising, systems nominal, final observation. Complete, station secured for handover. The response was brief. Acknowledged, transport en route, safe travels. The truck arrived at 1:13 hours. I loaded my personal belongings, handed over the station keys, signed the transfer documents. The driver asked if I wanted to look back as we descended the mountain. I did, watching the radar dishes grow smaller through the rear window. 3 gray structures against gray rock and gray sky. Isolated and purposeful. We drove down through the forest, through the fog that never quite lifted, back to the world of towns and people, and normal operational assignments. I thought about what I'd report during my debriefing at Facility Command, how I'd describe 5 months of observing signals from the mountains. The facts were documented, recorded in logbooks and chart paper and weekly summaries, but the experience, the sense of participating in something ancient and patient and vast that was harder to convey. I never learned what the signals were or where they originated. I never received analysis of the data I'd collected or explanation of what the observations meant. My debriefing at Facility Command was brief, professional, focused on confirming that I'd followed protocols and maintained proper documentation. The officer conducting the interview thanked me for my service, noted that my assignment had been satisfactory, and said I'd receive new posting information within 2 weeks. I asked if the station would remain operational, if another operator would continue the observations. She said that was classified information, not relevant to my current status. I asked what they'd learned from 5 months of monitoring. She said analysis was ongoing, results would be incorporated into operational planning, details were restricted. Yeah, I understood. I'd been a sensor, a recording device, not an analyst or decision maker. My new assignment came through in late April, a fire watch station in a different region, solitary posting. 6-month rotation starting in June. The work was completely different. Visual observation of forest conditions, no radar, no signals, no structured transmissions from unknown sources. Just trees and weather and the slow passage of seasons. But sometimes, late at night, I think about Station 47, about the contacts I observed and documented but never understood, about the operator before me, who'd logged similar events until operations were suspended, about whoever is there now, if anyone, watching the displays, recording the signals, participating in an observation program that stretches back decades without clear purpose or resolution. The signals are still there, in the mountains, transmitted from unknown sources during specific hours, detected by equipment designed for purposes beyond standard surveillance. Someone monitors them. Someone analyzes the data. Someone makes decisions based on information I helped collect, but will never see. And in the mountains, in the darkness between 0100 and 0500 hours, something continues transmitting, patient and persistent, waiting for the next operator to arrive and begin documentation. I was the night operator at a decommissioned radar station. I observed and reported, followed protocols, documented what I saw. The signals remain unexplained, the observation continues, and I carry the knowledge that some monitoring duties exist not to understand phenomena, but simply to maintain awareness that they persist, acknowledged but unresolved, waiting in the darkness for reasons I was never meant to comprehend.